Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's certainly a pleasure for me to rise to speak in favour of Bill C-12, the Democratic Representation Act, and to speak against the block amendment that would prevent it from going any further. Madam Speaker, the bill proposes a formula that would address the representation gap in the House of Commons affecting provinces with faster growing populations. Our government, Madam Speaker, is taking a principled approach. This bill, if passed unamended, will increase the number of MPs for faster-growing provinces to bring them closer to representation by population while protecting the current seat counts of slower-growing provinces. Under the current formula, Madam Speaker, for readjusting seats in the House, my province, the province of Alberta, has become significantly underrepresented despite a population surge in the last 2 decades. However, the Democratic Representation Act recognizes the growing populations of Ontario, of BC, and of Alberta by providing additional seats for the provinces on a principled basis, ensuring that all residents are fairly represented in this hallowed chamber. Madam Speaker, I support this bill. I support this bill unamended because it guarantees provinces such as mine it guarantees provinces whose populations are in relative decline, that's not mine, that those provinces will not lose any seats. All members in this place would like their provinces to have as much representation as possible. That's only natural. But we also have to look at the national interest by ensuring to the greatest extent possible that Canadians have fair representation no matter in what portion of Canada they live from coast to coast to coast. Madam Speaker, the need to balance effective representation of smaller provinces with the demographic realities in faster-growing provinces has underpinned each formula for distributing seats in the House ever since Confederation. On the one hand, historically, we've recognized that each province should have a number of seats in the House that roughly reflects its population relative to the rest of the provinces. But on the other hand, we acknowledge that smaller or slower-growing provinces need to have sufficient weight in this House to ensure that their voices are heard in decisions affecting the entire country. Madam Speaker, my remarks today will look at the historic evolution of the constitutional formula for distributing seats in the House of Commons. Constitution Act of 1867. Madam Speaker, the Fathers of Confederation agreed that the House of Commons should reflect democratic principles of representation, or rep by pop as it is colloquially known. Accordingly, the Constitution Act 1867 gave Quebec a fixed number of 65 seats, with the other provinces receiving the number of seats in proportion to their population that 65 represented in relation to Quebec's. This calculation was based entirely on the concept of rep by pop. Each province received the number of seats it deserved based on its share of the Canadian population. However, from the beginning, it was recognized that situations might, and in fact did arise, where it would be necessary to break away from the principles of pure rep by pop. For example, there was a rule in the 1867 Constitution that stated that no province would lose seats unless its population had decreased by 5% or more relative to Canada's total population. Shortly after Confederation, new provinces entered the Confederation. And when the new provinces of Manitoba and British Columbia entered in the early 1870s, they received a number of seats much higher than they would have based on pure rep by pop. This was an early example of Parliament recognizing that each province required a number of seats to have an effective say in the governance of this country. For example, the province of British Columbia joined Confederation with 6 seats in 1871, when its population at the time would have resulted in only 2 seats. BC continued to have 6 seats protected thanks to the, quote, 5% rule, unquote, I mentioned earlier, until the significant population growth in British Columbia resulted in more seats in 1903. Then there was the senatorial clause. Apart from the core seats that were allocated when new provinces entered Confederation, the formula for readjusting seats essentially stayed constant until 1915. At that point, Madam Speaker, a new rule was added to the Constitution, which provided no province could have fewer seats in the House of Commons than it had in the upper house. This new Senate floor rule came about after Prince Edward Island lost its court challenge seeking a larger share of seats in this House. Prince Edward Island strongly maintained it should have a minimum number of seats in the House, regardless of its population, to ensure it could effectively participate in the governance of this country. Although Prince Edward Island lost the court challenge, the province won a political victory in 1915 when the Constitution was amended to guarantee its seat count would never fall below the limit of 4 members of Parliament. There have been other changes in the formula, Madam Speaker. The constitutional formula was again changed in 1946 and then again in 1952 in an effort to guarantee a level of representation for Saskatchewan and Quebec, which had both seen relative declines in their population. The 1952 amendment created a new rule, Madam Speaker, where no province could lose more than 15% of its seats it had under the previous census. Finally, in 1974, a very complicated formula, the amalgam formula, was adopted, and I hope nobody during the question period asks me to explain it. But the amalgam formula applied different rules for allocating seats in the House depending on whether a province was large, intermediate, or small. While in theory the amalgam formula was designed to protect provinces with decreasing relative populations, it was soon discovered that applying the rules to the results of the 1981 census would have led to a huge number of new MPs being added to this House. So the current formula, Madam Speaker, because of the problems with the amalgam formula, the current formula was adopted by Parliament in 1985. The 1985 formula starts with a fixed number of 279 seats, which was the number of MPs in this House in 1985. And those seats are allocated among the provinces based on their share of the Canadian population at that time. This basically mirrors the rep by pop principle in the 1867 Constitution Act. Next, the Senate floor was applied to ensure that no province received fewer seats in this House than it has in the upper house. Finally, the grandfather clause guarantees all provinces receive, at a minimum, the number of seats they had when the new formula came into effect in 1985. The seat top-up, Madam Speaker, provided to some provinces represent the belief of the Fathers of Confederation that every Canadian deserves to have an effective voice in the governance of their country. Ironically, the very rules meant to protect the representation of smaller and slower-growing provinces have caused the faster-growing provinces to become underrepresented. Because of these distortions, the distortions created by the current formula, MPs in Ontario, British Columbia, and myself representing Alberta, on average represent 26,000 more constituents than MPs in the remaining provinces. Madam Speaker, this balance between effective representation and demographic reality, which our predecessors saw as so essential to Canadian democracy, is now being threatened. The underrepresentation of people in faster-growing provinces will grow worse each time the current formula is applied, unless Parliament acts now. So in conclusion, Madam Speaker, the Democratic Representation Act will bring Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta closer to representation by population while protecting the current seat counts of the remaining provinces. The new formula is principled, fair, and will not cause an undue increase in the number of members of Parliament in the House of Commons. Madam Speaker, I sincerely believe this solution balances the rights and expectations of all Canadians. As members of Parliament representing every part of this country, it's our responsibility to ensure our democratic institutions are inclusive and representative. Bill C-12 will go a long way towards achieving these important goals. So I encourage all members of this House to vote against the block amendment and pass C-12 unamended as expeditiously as possible. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments?